Son becomes rich and abandons his sick mother in an old village. But years later, when he returns, he is shocked by what he finds. But before that, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing amazing stories. In a small, rundown village on the outskirts of town, Sarah lived for one purpose: to provide her only son, John, with a future brighter than her own. She was a single mother, her health often failing her, but her love for John drove her to push through the pain and fatigue. Every morning, Sarah would wake up early to tend to her small vegetable garden, carefully picking the crops she would sell at the local market. Her hands were calloused, her back ached from years of hard labor, and her breathing grew heavier with each passing day, yet she never faltered. She smiled every time she thought of John's future, holding on to the hope that her sacrifices would be worth it. Their home was a small, dilapidated house that had seen better days. The wooden beams creaked under the weight of years, the roof leaked when it rained, and the walls bore the marks of age and wear. But to Sarah and John, it was the only place they could call home. It was where Sarah had nursed John through childhood illnesses, where she had told him stories to make him laugh, and where she had given him everything she could, despite having so little herself. The house may have been crumbling, but it was filled with memories, love, and a determination that one day, John would escape the harsh reality of their lives. As Sarah worked through her day, her breath occasionally caught in her chest, forcing her to pause and steady herself. She didn't tell John about these moments of weakness. How could she? He was her world, and she couldn't let him worry about her. She wanted him to focus on his studies, on his future, and not on the woman who could barely stand some days. She told herself that as long as John was happy, she would endure any hardship, no matter how severe. Every night, Sarah would sit by the window of their old home, staring out at the quiet village. She would wonder what the future held for John, picturing him leaving this place, heading out into the world beyond their small village. Even though the very thought of him leaving filled her heart with both pride and sorrow, she knew it was what she wanted most. She had lived a life of scarcity, but she dreamed that John would live a life of abundance. Years passed, and Sarah's unwavering dedication finally bore fruit. John left the familiar confines of their small village, carrying with him his mother's hopes and dreams as he ventured into the sprawling city. The transition wasn't easy, but John was determined to succeed. His sharp intellect and natural charisma quickly set him apart from the crowd. He climbed the ranks in the business world, starting with humble positions, but steadily making his way up. Each step of success fueled his ambition, pushing him further into a life of wealth and influence. As John's reputation grew, so did his fortune. He became known for his business acumen and relentless drive, turning modest investments into grand enterprises. His name was whispered in the corridors of power, and soon he was surrounded by people who admired him for his success. Luxury became the norm for John: lavish apartments, designer suits, and expensive dinners with powerful figures who sought his counsel. The life John once knew in the village began to fade from his memory. The old house, the simple meals, and his mother's tired but hopeful eyes felt like distant echoes. His focus was on the next deal, the next opportunity, the next summit of success. The further he rose, the less he thought of the place he had left behind. John's phone calls to Sarah became infrequent, his visits non-existent. He told himself he was simply too busy, that his mother would understand. After all, this was the life she had always wanted for him, wasn't it? Despite the fortune and the recognition, something began to shift within John. The thrill of success slowly dulled, replaced by a persistent, nagging emptiness that he couldn't quite explain. He had achieved everything he set out to, but as the years went by, there was an unsettling quiet in the spaces where his victories should have brought fulfillment. As the months turned into years, John's life in the city consumed him. His schedule was packed with meetings, business trips, and high-profile events. Though he occasionally thought of his mother, those moments were fleeting, quickly overshadowed by his growing responsibilities. When he did think of her, he would send a small amount of money, a token gesture that he convinced himself was enough. In his mind, he was supporting her in the best way he could, given his busy life. Whenever Sarah received one of John's small checks, she would clutch it tightly in her hands, not for the money it represented, but for the connection it symbolized to her distant son. She would smile, even as her heart ached, and she would tuck the check away, often saving it for the times when her health required medication she could no longer afford on her own. Despite John's absence, Sarah never allowed herself to feel anger or resentment. Her love for him remained unwavering, rooted in the memories of his childhood and the belief that he was simply caught up in the whirlwind of his success. But as time passed, Sarah's body began to show the toll of her long years of labor and neglect. Her hands, once strong enough to tend the garden and keep their small home running, began to tremble with weakness. Her chest felt tight more often than not, and the simple act of walking across the room left her winded. Yet she told no one, not John, not her neighbors, about the growing pain inside her. She kept it hidden, believing that one day, when John's life settled down, he would return to her and she could finally rest. She continued to write him letters, though they often went unanswered. In each one, she reassured him that she was doing well, and that she was proud of all he had accomplished. She would add small reminders of the village, hoping to bring back the nostalgia of their shared past. And even when her body began to fail her, she never let go of the hope that her son would come home. 5 long years had slipped by since John's last visit to the small village where his mother lived. In that time, he had transformed into a titan of industry, a man whose name was synonymous with power and wealth. John's business empire stretched across multiple cities, employing thousands and generating profits that only continued to soar. He was celebrated at exclusive events, photographed for the covers of prestigious magazines, and surrounded by people who praised his every move. But as his influence expanded, something else began to shrink: his connection to the life he once knew, and to the woman who had made his success possible. The memory of his mother, Sarah, became less vivid with each passing day. Where once her voice and her presence had filled his heart with warmth, now there was only a faint echo. The old house, the quiet village, the sacrifices she made, they all started to fade into the background of John's busy life. His focus was on his next big deal, the next investment, the next acquisition. The people around him only reinforced this focus, encouraging him to push further, to achieve more, without a thought for what he might be leaving behind. Occasionally, in rare moments of solitude, John would think of Sarah, but those thoughts were fleeting, brushed aside by the demands of his growing empire. He told himself that he would visit her soon, that he would take some time to go back to the village and see her, but soon turned into later, and later into never. His life was a whirlwind of activity, and there was always something more pressing that required his attention. The letters she had sent, the small checks he mailed back, those were the only ties left between them, and even those were becoming more sporadic as the years went on. John's world became one of high-rise buildings, luxury cars, and endless meetings. The simplicity of his past was buried under the weight of his success. The boy who had once clung to his mother's hand was now a man driven by ambition, surrounded by wealth but increasingly alone in a crowd that only cared about what he could provide. One evening, as John sat in his lavish office overlooking the bustling city, he received an invitation that stirred something deep within him. It was an invitation to a reunion, an event where old friends from his childhood village would gather. The invitation was simple, written in a familiar but now distant tone. It mentioned names he hadn't thought of in years, people he had once shared his early life with before his rise to wealth and power. At first, John felt no strong inclination to attend. After all, what could those people possibly understand about the life he now led? The thought of returning to that small, forgotten place seemed beneath him. Yet the idea of showing off his success to those who once knew him as just another village boy began to appeal to his pride. It would be a perfect opportunity to demonstrate just how far he had come, how he had outgrown the humble origins of his past. But beneath the surface of that confident reasoning, there was something else, something quieter that made John pause. It wasn't the grandeur of the city or the flash of his achievements that gave him this moment of hesitation. It was something he couldn't quite name. As he stared at the invitation, the names on the paper felt like ghosts of a life he had abandoned, tugging at a part of him he had long since buried. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if returning to the village meant more than just showing off his success. But before he could dwell too much on that thought, he shook it off and convinced himself that it was merely nostalgia playing tricks on him. John finally decided to accept the invitation, but not without some reluctance. He made plans to attend, telling himself it would be a brief trip, a quick reminder of where he came from, nothing more. He would show up, bask in the admiration of old acquaintances, and then leave without looking back. What he didn't realize, however, was that this trip would set in motion a series of events that would change everything he thought he knew. When John arrived in the village, he was immediately struck by how much had changed since he had left. The once lively streets were quieter. The familiar faces of his youth were either gone or aged beyond recognition. The village, which had once felt like the center of his small world, now seemed smaller, worn down, and forgotten by time. He drove slowly through the narrow streets, his expensive car out of place in this simple setting. It all felt foreign to him, like visiting the set of an old movie he no longer felt connected to. But what truly stopped him in his tracks was the sight of his mother's house. The place that had once been his home, filled with warmth and the smell of homemade meals, now stood before him in a state of utter decay. The roof sagged dangerously in places. The windows were broken or boarded up, and the garden, once meticulously tended by Sarah, was overrun with weeds and brambles. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood underneath exposed to the elements, dark and weathered. John's heart sank. He hadn't expected to see the house in such ruin. He had assumed it would have aged, of course, but he hadn't imagined this level of neglect. Guilt gnawed at him, though he tried to push it aside. He told himself that it wasn't his fault. After all, he had sent money. Surely that should have been enough to keep the place in better shape. But no amount of rationalization could erase the hollow feeling growing inside him as he stared at the house that had once been a symbol of his mother's love and sacrifice. For a moment, John hesitated. Part of him didn't want to go inside, didn't want to face whatever reality lay beyond the dilapidated door. The memories of his childhood came flooding back, images of his mother smiling at him, of the two of them sitting together on the porch. He could almost hear her voice calling his name, but the sound was distant, like a memory blurred by years of neglect. Steeling himself, John took a deep breath and stepped toward the front door. As John pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the dimly lit house, the air felt heavy and thick with dust. The inside was as decayed as the outside, with cracked walls and broken furniture scattered around the room. The familiar warmth of his childhood was long gone, replaced by an eerie silence that made his footsteps echo through the empty space. The room smelled of dampness and abandonment, as though it had been untouched for years. John's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and that's when he saw him. Mr. Wilson, the old neighbor who had lived across the street for as long as John could remember. The man was seated in a faded rocking chair, positioned near the window that overlooked the overgrown garden. Mr. Wilson's hair was thinner and grayer than John recalled, and his face bore the marks of time and hardship. His eyes, though tired, glistened with a deep sadness that seemed to weigh down his entire being. John stood frozen for a moment, caught off guard by the presence of this familiar figure in his mother's house. He hadn't expected to see anyone here, let alone Mr. Wilson. Slowly he moved closer, unsure of what to say. Mr. Wilson looked up at John, and recognition flickered across his worn features. "John," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made John's chest tighten. The old man's gaze lingered on John for a moment before he shifted his eyes back to the window. He began to speak again, his voice barely more than a whisper, as though the memories he carried were too heavy to bear aloud. "I didn't think you'd come back," Mr. Wilson continued, his tone laced with a quiet sorrow. "It's been so long since anyone stepped foot in this house. I've been keeping an eye on it best I could, but—" His words trailed off as he glanced around the deteriorating room, a flicker of regret crossing his face. John felt a knot form in his stomach. He could sense that Mr. Wilson had something more to say, something he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. He waited in the thick silence, the walls of the house seeming to close in on him as Mr. Wilson took a slow, deep breath. "She always hoped you'd come back," the old man said finally, his voice soft but firm. "But a lot has changed since you've been gone, John. A lot that you need to know." Mr. Wilson's voice cracked slightly as he shifted in the rocking chair, eyes still fixed on the view outside the broken window. John stood nearby, his body tense as he awaited the words that would forever alter his understanding of the years he had been away. "Your mother," Mr. Wilson began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She held on for as long as she could, John. She never stopped believing that you would come back. Even when she got sick, she refused to let go of that hope. Every day she would sit by the window, waiting for a letter, a call, anything from you." John's throat tightened, guilt surging through him. He tried to speak, but no words came. His mind raced back to those moments when he had considered visiting, writing, or calling, but had always allowed the demands of his life to take priority. She got weaker, Mr. Wilson continued, his tone soft but unwavering. Her body started to fail her, but her spirit, that was something else. She kept that smile on her face, telling anyone who'd listen that her boy was doing great things, that one day you'd walk through that door and everything would be all right again. The weight of the old man's words pressed heavily on John's chest. He could almost see his mother sitting by that same window, her fragile frame growing smaller as the days turned into years. Mr. Wilson paused for a moment, letting out a heavy sigh. But time wears us all down eventually. She waited, John. She waited until her body just couldn't anymore. 3 years ago, she passed away in this very house, still holding on to the hope that you'd come back to her. John felt as though the floor had fallen out from beneath him. His legs grew weak, and he found himself sinking into the nearest chair. He hadn't realized how much he had taken her presence for granted, assuming she'd always be there whenever he decided to return. The realization that she had spent her final years alone, waiting for him, was almost too much to bear. She never blamed you, Mr. Wilson said quietly. Not once. She was proud of you. Until her last breath, she believed you'd come back. That's just the kind of person she was, full of love even when she was hurting. John's world shattered the moment Mr. Wilson's words fully sunk in. It was as though time had stopped, and the weight of everything he had neglected for years came crashing down on him all at once. He dropped to his knees on the dusty floor, his hands gripping the edges of the worn-out chair as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't from the success that had once driven him. It was from an agonizing realization of what he had lost. The room around him felt like it was closing in, suffocating him with the memories of a past he had abandoned. His mother's face flashed before his eyes, her soft smile, the warmth in her eyes, the way she always believed in him, even when no one else did. All those times she had sat by the window, waiting for him, filled with hope that he would return to her. And he never did. The magnitude of his guilt was unbearable. Tears that he had long since forgotten how to shed began to stream down his face. The fortune he had amassed, the accolades he had received, the endless cycle of deals and profits, it all felt meaningless now. What good was success when it had cost him the one person who had loved him unconditionally? He had sacrificed so much to reach the top, and now he realized that the price had been far too high. His heart felt hollow, his achievements suddenly empty, and no amount of money or power could ever bring her back. John clutched at his chest as the pain became overwhelming. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let the distance grow so vast between them, thinking that he could always return whenever it suited him? The truth, raw and unforgiving, settled heavily over him. He had waited too long, and now it was too late. His mother had died believing in him, holding on to a love that he had taken for granted. Mr. Wilson slowly rose from the rocking chair, his frail hands trembling slightly as he walked toward an old, weathered chest in the corner of the room. He knelt down with effort and carefully lifted the lid, revealing a small aged box inside. With a solemn expression, he picked up the box and brought it over to John, who was still kneeling on the floor, lost in his grief. This, Mr. Wilson said quietly, is something your mother left for you. She wanted you to have it when the time was right. John looked up, his face streaked with tears, as Mr. Wilson gently placed the box in his hands. It was an old wooden box, worn with time, but clearly cared for. John's fingers traced the carvings on the surface, feeling the weight of the history it carried. He hesitated for a moment before opening it, knowing that whatever was inside would be a final connection to the mother he had lost. When John opened the box, his breath caught in his throat. Inside were dozens of letters, each one addressed to him in Sarah's delicate handwriting. They were neatly stacked, yellowed at the edges but still intact. John picked up the first letter and unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the familiar script. The words on the page were filled with love, encouragement, and hope. Sarah had written to him regularly, though the letters had never been sent. Each letter spoke of her pride in him, her unwavering belief in his success, and her deep, abiding love. Even as her health failed, she never once expressed resentment or disappointment. Instead, she focused on her hopes for his future, always believing that he would return to her someday. John's hands shook as he read through the letters, each one a reminder of the love he had so foolishly overlooked. He could feel her presence in every word, a mother's love that had transcended time and distance, and now even death. But as he reached the bottom of the stack, he found something else, something small and metallic. Nestled beneath the final letter was a small rusted key. Attached to it was a faded tag with a handwritten message, "For the future you will build." John stared at the key for a long moment, his mind swirling with questions. What had his mother meant by this? What future had she envisioned for him? The weight of the key in his hand felt symbolic, as if it held the answer to something greater than he could yet comprehend. But whatever it was, John knew one thing. It was meant for him, and only him. The letters weighed heavily on John's heart, each one an unspoken conversation between a mother and her absent son. As he read through them, Sarah's voice became more than just ink on paper. It was a force that stirred something deep within him. Every word revealed the unshakable faith she had in him, the love that never wavered despite the distance, and the hope that he would one day use his success for something meaningful. Sarah had never stopped believing in the man John could become, even when he had strayed far from the path she had hoped for him. John folded the final letter and placed it carefully back in the box. The weight of his mother's words filled him with both regret and a newfound resolve. He couldn't change the past, but he could honor her memory by ensuring that her values lived on. Her legacy of kindness, compassion, and selflessness would not be forgotten. It was time for John to act, not out of guilt, but out of a desire to fulfill the vision his mother had always held for him. Using his vast resources, John began working to restore the village where he had grown up. It was a place that had once been vibrant, but over time had fallen into decay, just like his mother's house. He funded the renovation of homes, ensuring that every family had a safe place to live. He brought in medical professionals to provide care for the elderly and the sick, services that his mother herself had desperately needed in her final years. Education programs were established for the children, giving them opportunities that he himself had lacked when he was young. John didn't stop there. He created community centers where people could gather, learn, and support one another. The village began to thrive in ways it hadn't for decades, with new life and hope spreading through its streets. As the village transformed, so too did the lives of the people who lived there, many of whom had suffered silently for years. Sarah's values, compassion, generosity, and a deep sense of community, guided every decision John made. In each project, he saw the reflection of the lessons she had taught him through her own actions. For the first time in years, John wasn't thinking about profit margins or business deals. He was thinking about people, about creating a future that his mother would be proud of. John stood at the edge of the village, gazing at the place that had once been a backdrop to his humble beginnings and the life he had left behind. Now it was a thriving community, a testament to his mother's enduring spirit and the love she had instilled in him. The transformation was not just in the buildings or the programs he had funded. It was in the people who now walked the streets with hope in their hearts, knowing they were cared for and valued. Though he couldn't rewrite the past or bring his mother back, John had found a way to honor her memory in the most meaningful way possible. He had made it his mission to ensure that no one would ever feel as abandoned and forgotten as Sarah had. In every project he undertook, every hand he extended to help another, he saw her legacy shining through. The fulfillment he now felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced during his years of building a business empire. It wasn't money or power that gave him this sense of peace. It was the knowledge that he was making a real difference in the lives of others. John's life took on a new purpose. He no longer chased the fleeting satisfaction of wealth and recognition. Instead, he sought out ways to uplift those who were struggling, just as his mother had done for him so many years ago. He established foundations to support the poor, the sick, and the elderly, creating safety nets for those who had been left behind by society. And as he poured his heart into this work, John discovered something unexpected. A profound sense of contentment, a joy that no amount of money had ever been able to buy. Every time John looked at the key his mother had left him, he was reminded of the simple, yet powerful message she had believed in, that the future was something to be built with love, compassion, and generosity. That key now symbolized more than just a physical door. It was a door to a future he had chosen to create, one where Sarah's spirit lived on in every act of kindness he performed. In the end, John realized that his mother had given him the greatest gift of all, the understanding that true wealth wasn't measured in riches or accolades, but in the lives he touched and the love he shared. For the first time, John felt whole, anchored not by material success, but by the gratitude and love that now defined his life.